This is the Week in Sustainability from Workiva Carbon, formerly Sustain Life. It's where our team of experts and practitioners share weekly insights and commentary to keep you up to date about all things sustainability. Hello, and welcome back to the Week in Sustainability. I'm your host, Alyssa Zucker. And today we're diving into two really important stories that highlight how climate policy and education are both evolving in response to the growing urgency around environmental challenges. So first, we're going to start with a very cool requirement coming out of the University of California, San Diego, which is requiring students as part of their curriculum to take a climate-focused course as part of their prerequisite courses. Then we're going to shift, staying in California, but shift from education over to policy. And we're going to look at the California government and its longstanding role of being a climate policy leader, how it's navigating some of the political challenges facing environmental regulations today as we approach the upcoming election. So let's start with education because this is really cool. University of California at San Diego, you might be thinking climate change education is not particularly new, and there's plenty of courses and degree programs that focus on this. And that is true. But the UC San Diego approach is taking a slightly different strategy here beyond offering optional electives or major courses of studies that you can major or minor in as degree programs, and is now requiring a mandatory requirement for all students that is designed to prepare them for the future where climate change is going to affect their lives. It's going to affect their career. It's going to affect their community. And that's the fundamental reasoning behind this course, that regardless of your major, your intended area of focus, or your career ambitions, there's critical knowledge that is needed to prepare yourself for the realities of your future. That's what the prerequisite courses are meant to really support and facilitate at universities. And so now, seeing through that lens, how one of those topics is climate change, it will impact you through some course of your life. I personally wish that in my own undergraduate education, they had included tax filings as a required course. I think something we all need to do, but I am happy to see that they brought the climate change in as a required offering. So let's talk a little bit about what the course requirements are. So the course has to consist of 30% climate-related content and address two of the four kind of following topics or foundations. One, scientific foundations of climate change. Two, human impacts. Three, mitigation strategies. And four, project-based learning. So the university is offering 41 courses that satisfy those different requirements. And those courses are ranging from things like indigenous approaches to climate change, to gender and climate justice, to environmentalism in arts and media. And so the program is both inclusive and comprehensive, where, again, no matter what your major is, whether it's more technical in sciences or more liberal arts or something in media and communication, there is a course within each of those focused on climate change. And many of them do actually overlap with DEI courses as well, because as we know, climate change isn't just a physical or environmental issue. It really permeates all aspects of society and is truly a societal issue across our own socio and economic kind of foundations. So that's actually one of the unique perspectives in this requirement, that a lot of these classes really focus on climate justice. And a lot of them explore kind of the intersection of gender and race and socioeconomic status, revealing, just the different perspective that communities are kind of grappling with the impacts of global warming and climate change. And I think that this really speaks to the fact that climate change, it's not just about environmental science. Of course, the science and the climatology and the environmental chemistry, that's a core part of it, but that it really permeates to our very core foundational societal institutions. So whether you're looking at this from kind of the macro global perspective of the global South's disproportionate exposure to deathly extreme weather events, like Pakistan, for example, their 2022 flooding that killed over 1,700 people and affected the lives of 30 million. Or whether you're looking at this from heat-related deaths observed in Europe, or the increased frequency of intense hurricanes that we're seeing here in the US with Milton and Helene. These impacts require a robust and thoughtful mitigation and adaptation strategy both physically, but again, also in how we address economically, socially, politically, the realistic impacts of climate change. And this is actually part of a broader movement. While UC San Diego is one of the first universities that's kind of being touted and applauded for including this as a required prerequisite, it's not the only university to, in some way, shift or focus the curriculum and studies on climate change. And again, part of a broader movement, right? There's a recent Marist poll that shows 85% of Gen Z are concerned about the climate crisis. And this signals the generational demand for meaningful climate education. This is something that this generation understands impacts them, is unavoidable, is going to have an omnipresence throughout their life, and want to understand different strategies that they can employ, decisions they can make, holistic perspectives they can think through of how to address that. When we look at some other institutions, a couple of big names, Harvard, Columbia, Stanford, they're all taking a step to further create focus on this with actual dedicated entire schools within their universities that are dedicated to climate. And this is something that I'm actually quite close to from both my undergrad and graduate education. When I was in graduate school, I went to school for climate change, but it was kind of anchored in the public policy school. I was at Columbia University's SEPA, and so that's a school of international public policy. And that actually predated what exists today, where if you're going for the same degree program, which is a master's in environmental science and policy, that now sits in a newly created climate school. That was an investment that Columbia saw they needed. There was an educational demand for it, and they've really invested resources specific to climate change, which, yes, has a major policy component, but kind of needed to carve out its own school and institution within the university. Similarly, with undergrad, I work with an alumni-based group. With my school's undergrad, I went to WashU in St. Louis, and working with a stakeholder group of both alumni and the school administration to think about how can they create climate-focused program and curriculum at that institution to really make it a central hub of the university. Again, this is something that we see across institutions, across geography, across size and scale, public-private institutions, that climate is a curriculum and an area of focus that they want to invest in because it both is this pervasive thing that everybody needs to understand and will deal with, but also professionally, there are so many burgeoning fields, whether it is carbon accounting or environmental engineering or corporate reporting or renewables and energy infrastructure, that are all anchored in this idea of the transition to net zero in response to climate change. So really exciting on the education front. Let's shift. We'll keep it in California, but let's shift to the political or the legislative approach here. So California and broader climate policy. This state has always led the nation with very ambitious environmental regulations. And that includes dedicated plans to phase out gas-powered cars by 2035, as well as promote net zero technologies for heavy-duty trucks by 2045. And that's actually a really big focus here. While we see kind of broad support for vehicle and what we call light-duty passenger vehicles, shifting towards electrification and net zero, when it comes to the heavy-duty vehicles and trucking, it's a bit more of an ambiguous space. And so what California has done is put forth leading regulations that would require that industry to move towards net zero. However, leaders essentially at every level of the government are currently facing a dual threat. One is the potential return of a Trump administration, which, as we know, less friendly to environmental regulation. And number two is a little similarly, but a Supreme Court that is stacked with Trump appointees that traditionally and historically have been hostile to climate regulation. So let's break this down a little bit. I think the return to the Trump administration has a pretty straightforward impact. His campaign and past presidency makes it pretty clear that his intent to not only curtail environmental regulations, but to actually actively roll back those that are already in place. I think what the more nuanced story is here is about the battle of the courts. And this is actually very cool. So California has a unique authority to set its own stricter than federal tailpipe emission standards through what's called a waiver under the Clean Air Act. And that is essentially the EPA providing a waiver to the state of California to say, you can do things that are stricter than what our federal policy is. And so there's currently 8 waivers in the EPA's backlog that, again, are recommending stricter tailpipe emissions on a broader range of vehicles. So everything from trucks to tugboats, passenger vehicles, your lawnmower, as well as trains. And now Trump has already announced that if he wins, he's simply going to revoke the waiver that grants California this allowance. But even if he doesn't win, the industries that oppose these regulations are going to go after the rules in courts. And that is if the case makes its way into the Supreme Court, which over the past 2 years has significantly really rolled back and limited the EPA's ability to protect wetlands and regulate greenhouse gases, is very much a cause for concern. And so this is where it's maybe in the weeds, but I think this is so interesting. And we've spoken about both of these things on the podcast before. There are essentially 2 major ways in which the Supreme Court could strike down this EPA approval process. And we've spoken about these in previous episodes. So one is the major questions doctrine. So this essentially is what bars agencies from resolving questions of vast economic and political significance without clear authorization from Congress. And so this is what the court used most recently to block the EPA's Clean Power Plan, which was an EPA rule that sought to limit greenhouse gas emissions from existing power plants. So under this strategy, the courts could essentially claim that California's tailpipe emissions regulations represent a major transformation of industry with vast economic impact and come against it that way. The other tool in their toolbox, so to speak, is the overturning of the Chevron deference. So this rolled back authority of federal agencies to interpret language in laws, which most recently, you may have remembered, featured on this podcast, limited the EPA's ability to protect wetlands under the Clean Water Act. So under this strategy, the courts could basically say that the EPA is wrong in how it interprets compelling and extraordinary circumstances that allows it to grant California these waivers. So there's a couple of different threats here just from the court, from the legal system. And to adapt, California is shifting their strategy a little bit. So they are pivoting to focus their proposed regulations more so on pollutants like ozone and particulate matter, which have a bit more of an established basis under the Clean Air Act than greenhouse gas emissions. So this approach could provide a stronger legal footing if cases do reach the Supreme Court, because they're anchored, quite frankly, not in greenhouse gas emissions, which, as we know, can become a little bit politicized, but more so in other environmental and air pollutants that have a more short-term and kind of acute impact on human health versus the longer-term lag of greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. The state is also employing some other tactics that avoid federal regulation and kind of this whole mess of the impending court cases altogether. So they're looking to partner directly with the industries that they are seeking to regulate. There's a consortium of, again, car manufacturers that the government is coming together on their electrification and transition to net zero for the mobile transportation industry. They're also looking at incentive-based policies. So again, I think your cash back rewards for making decisions that accelerate towards that transition, as well as some ballot measures for carbon pricing and initiatives. So when we look at both of these stories, there's this really interesting parallel that's going on, both from an educational perspective as well as kind of a more legislative climate policy in California. And both really reflect this shift towards integrating climate resilience into our systems, whether it's regulation or education. So just as UC San Diego is preparing students for a climate challenged world where you're going to have to think about this and address this problem and navigate this, California policymakers are strategizing on how do you maintain state-led climate actions amidst the legal and political uncertainties that are not going to go away and will continue to be a contradictory force against that climate agenda. So that's all I have for you for today's episode. I hope you found it as interesting as I did. Thank you for tuning in, and we will see you next week for another week in sustainability. Workiva Carbon provides organizations with an easy-to-use solution to manage the full life cycle of measuring, managing, and reporting carbon emissions. Now integrated into the same platform used to manage the world's most trusted financial and non-financial reporting. Don't forget to like and subscribe to this show on our YouTube channel or your favorite podcast platform. See you next week.